everybody, and welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce today Nina Vanhoutte, who is a PhD student at the Department of Literature of Ghent University. She completed her BA in Greek and Latin Literature and Linguistics at Ghent University in 2019, and her MA in Historical Literature and Linguistics in 2020 with highest distinction. In October 2020, she started a PhD in Greek literature under the supervision of Félix Bernat, and her research builds upon the topic of her MA thesis, that is social literary studies of the genre characteristic of 7 didactic poems on grammar, written by the 11th century author Niketas of Herakleia. In 2021, she also won the FWO scholarship to expand this PhD project to include the preparation of a critical edition, translation, and commentary of these 7 poems. And today, Nina will deliver a paper entitled "The Horse-Loving Man Who Teaches," Niketas of Herakleia's didactic poem on syntax. Nina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgia. Thank you for this introduction. And thank you also for inviting me to speak and to give this lecture. I'm very excited to be able to share my research with the many people virtually present. I will not waste any time. I'll share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Can someone confirm for me that the screen you are seeing is the full screen PowerPoint? Okay, great. All right then. So my presentation today, as Georgia mentioned, is called "The Horse-Loving Man Who Teaches." This will become clear why at the end of my presentation. So I will first give a brief overview and some context on my topic in general, so the broader context of what I am doing, and also talk a bit about my corpus. And then I will hone in on one poem in particular of my corpus, namely Niketas's poem named "On Syntax." So this is a provisional title of the poem, but I would like to share some excerpts of this with you. So to begin, my project has 2 main goals. So the first goal is that I'm creating critical editions of 7 didactic poems written by Niketas, including translation, commentary, and discussion of source material. Discussion of source material, by this I mean the source that Niketas used for the content of his poems. I will come back on this later. The second main part of my project will be a literary analysis. That's more for the latter half of my PhD, as to what the typical genre characteristics are for Byzantine didactic poetry. In this case, I would like to see the interaction between characteristics and their historical context. And I would love to do a comparison between Niketas and some contemporary authors' work. So, for example, Michael Psellos. I will have to see time-wise what I can do, but I have already been working a bit on the genre characteristics since my MA thesis, and I will present some preliminary findings today. The ultimate goal is to create a philological, literary, and socio-cultural study of Byzantine didactic poetry of mainly the 11th century and also the 12th. So that's the project. What is didactic poetry? So for those of you who may not be as familiar with the genre, didactic poems are poems used for teaching about a certain topic. So I listed a few possible topics. All of these exist. I mean, there's poems about all of these topics. Mine revolve around grammar, as mentioned. And the goal of these poems of the genre is mainly to transfer knowledge. So I say mainly because as this is the main goal, there's also always additional goals at play. The authors want to show off their knowledge, their expertise, their literary skills, both to peers, to their patrons, so often the imperial family as well. So there's always additional, let's say, social goals, but the main goal is still to transfer this knowledge. The genre, these poems have been popular since antiquity. So although today I am speaking on Byzantine didactic poems, it has been popular in antiquity as well, both Latin and Greek poems. As far as I know, there's also some other cultures that have didactic poems, but I'm not as well versed in those, of course. These poems are often based on prose treatises, and the author versifies, so puts in verse the source material from these treatises. Now, an inherent quality of these poems is that they are synoptic, by which I mean they have to focus on a very specific topic to be able to fit it all into a poem. So they cannot, versify a whole grammar handbook in one poem. So authors usually specifically state what particular topic they will discuss, and then they also love to show off the qualities of conciseness in their poems. They will explicitly refer to this even. And another way you can see the synoptic quality is through the structure of the poems. So the narratological structure, they will make reference to things like, oh, let's not waste time, let's continue on. Now I will discuss this thing very briefly. So the narratological structure helps with this quality. Some other genre characteristics that I will illustrate in the latter half of my presentation. Some of these come from the work of Katharina Volk. She made a very important work in 2002 about ancient didactic poems and their genre characteristics. And she listed 4 characteristics that she thinks are necessary to be able to speak about a didactic poem. I didn't list all 4 here, but it is a very interesting work, so do go read it if you're interested. So one of the characteristics she explains is the teacher-student interaction, or the presence of the teacher-student in the poem. This will become clear when I show you some examples. But yes, it is somewhat self-explanatory. The teacher and the student are very much present in the poem, and their interaction is as well. There's also explicit didactic intent. So the author or the poem has to explicitly state that they want to teach someone something. And then there's also things like metaphors, like the horse racing metaphor, and intertextuality through citations and quotations and other things. That being said, I'm almost done with the context, just a little more historical context, because it is important for the socio-cultural aspect of my project. So my poems are written by Niketas in the 11th century. As I mentioned, these poems are also popular in antiquity. Then there's a bit of a gap between the 6th and the 10th, where we don't really have any didactic poems, Greek didactic poems delivered. And then they became popular again in the 11th and 12th century. And this is due to some changed circumstances in this period. So first of all, there was a new meter, the political verse, or the 15-syllable verse, created, commonly agreed in the 10th century, beginning of the 11th. And it very quickly became associated and popularly used for didactic poems. It's not the only genre it was used for, but one of the main qualities of political verse that was attributed to it by contemporary authors was that it combines playfulness and seriousness. And this is a quality also ascribed to didactic poems. So in that case, they are linked. Also in the 11th and 12th century, education became more valued, and it enabled social climbing. So the upper echelons, so to say, of the Byzantine society in these centuries became, well, they valued an education more in that they would give good jobs and good positions to people who got an education. And it was relatively, shall we say, democratic in the sense that anyone who could pay for an education could get an education and thus climb in the rankings. This is, of course, not as democratic as we have it now, but it is still better than some previous centuries, and it is a change. So this is important to keep in mind. And then another big thing was the interaction between teachers and students. So they kept a close bond even after the student finished their education, and they maintained this for social benefits. So we have, for example, some letters, I think from Michael Psellos, among others, where he writes to a student, the student writes to him, they reminisce, and they ask each other for favors. And this was important because a teacher relied for his money on his reputation. Teachers were rivals because students could just pick a teacher, pay them, and then get an education. So their reputation was very important to get an income. And this rivalry, this close bond, all this interlaced, these interactions are present in the didactic poems from the century, at least from the corpus I'm working with, but I believe wider as well. And then lastly, our author, Niketas of Herakleia, as mentioned, 11th century author and teacher. We do believe that he used these poems, in fact, in the classroom. And it is most likely that he did write them while he was still a teacher and not later when he became Bishop of Herakleia. He's more known for his Christian works, just because those have been edited and worked on more. His secular works, he wrote 24 didactic poems. There has not been much work done on those. 24 didactic poems, most of those are written in church meter, so hymnographical meter. 7 of them have not been written in church meter, and those are the 7 poems that I'm working on. They are written in what we call a stichic meter, which basically just encompasses political verse and dodecasyllable, so the 12-syllable verse. Which brings me lastly to my corpus. I have not given them official titles yet. I do use the title On Syntax for the poem that I'm discussing today, but this is still provisionary. Usually I refer to them by the designations you see in the left-hand column. These were made for the first time by Schneider in 1999. And they work very well, in my opinion, so I've kept them. So the first 3 poems, D1 to D3, are written in dodecasyllables, hence the D. And then P1 to P4 written in political verse. Their subjects range from orthography, morphology, syntax, but all to do with Greek grammar. And as you can see, most of them are a similar length, except for the last one, which is a bit of an outlier with 1,079 verses. Today I will be discussing P3, so the second to last poem, named On Syntax. Should you have any other questions about the corpus or the manuscript situation or whatever, feel free to ask this afterwards. And that brings us to P3. I'll refer to it as On Syntax from now on, just to make it a bit easier. I'll briefly discuss the structure of the poem and then discuss some fragments with you all. So the poem begins with a sort of prologue, introductory verses. I will go into this in a bit. And then after this prologue, in which Niketas basically explains what he is going to discuss, there's the first half, the first main part of the poem, in which he explains verbs that have different meanings depending on which grammatical case they are combined with. So I gave a little example here. To dialato genike, to diaferonoi, poligar dialatomen alilon phiseitis. That was a bit of a mix of pronunciation, apologies. What he writes here, so consider dialato, the verb dialato, with a genitive, to mean to differ, diafero. As someone would say, we differ a lot from one another. So what he does here is first explain, this verb combined with a case means this, and then an example. This is a common way that he uses in the first half to explain different words. Then the interlude is a very interesting middle part that I will also discuss with you, in which he extensively uses this race course metaphor to break up his poem in 2 halves and to, I think to make it a bit more interesting as well. And then the second half of the poem is about a different part of syntax, but also about compound verbs. So verbs that have different prepositions added to it, and then what cases they should be combined with. So again, I added an example to make it more clear. Uk apoptue chalinon, kimon udiaptue, ude prosptue te kriti, u hortu kataptue. So as you may have noticed, 4 times the same base verb, tuo, each time combined with a different preposition or prefix. So apoptuo, diaptuo, etc. And each time also combined with a different case. So the literal translation of these 2 verses is, oh, he does not spit out the bit, nor does he spit upon the muzzle. He does not spit upon the barley, nor upon the fodder. So you can translate this, and it's a little, I wouldn't say story, but the second half of the poem is written like this. So as a little story that continues this horse metaphor. However, he does not explicitly say anymore, apoptue should be combined with an accusative, and diaptue with an accusative as well. And then he doesn't say it as explicitly anymore. It's more implicit. You have to infer it yourself. This is something that I've also noticed in some of the other poems in the corpus that he tends to do. Not in all of them. I also haven't gone through all of them yet, but in some he does do this combination of first I explain it more extensively, and then in the second half you just have to do it yourself, basically. And then he ends with a sort of epilogue to round off his poem. So let us look at some of the excerpts. So the prologue, the interlude, and the ending. The first 13 verses, I had to do it in 2 slides, of course. I won't go over the Greek every time, but if you do have any questions, feel free to ask me. I will say, however, that both my edition and my translation are still a work in progress. They're not perfect yet. I don't understand all of it perfectly, but it's good so far. So if you have any suggestions afterwards, feel free to let me know. So what then about syntax, he asks. This is surely not to be overlooked. No, even if it is altogether a hard-wrought task, so that the crows won't crow at an unfinished work, or, as Hesiod said, at an unfinished house. But there are many of these parts, while I have only a few words, because I am not allowed to breathe much because of the sickness. So he starts with a sort of rhetorical question to a student like, oh, we can't stop here, we still have to do this part of syntax, even if it's difficult and you don't like to do it, it's hard work, but we have to do it. And then he kind of adapts a quote of Hesiod, so from his Work and Days, so that the crows won't crow at an unfinished house, but here, as he said, an unfinished work. This is an interesting reference because A, he explicitly mentions the source, which he does not always do. And B, well, Hesiod is often seen as sort of the father of didactic poems, and his Work and Days is also seen as one of the earlier didactic poems. So this is, in my opinion, this is a reference he put there to place himself in this tradition that he is writing in. And then he says, well, there are many parts that I have to discuss, but I have only a few words. And he attributes this to being ill, but at the same time, this brachylogoi can also be seen as a mention of this synoptic quality that they love to present in their poems. Like, oh, I can explain this difficult thing in a few words only, in a short treatise, in a short poem. So how should we treat the words in this challenge? Saying what is necessary so that we leave nothing out, while avoiding satiety so that we do not weigh our students down with it. I found an easy method to treat this. I shall omit the simple constructions as they are excessive, but I shall take the double constructions and explain those. Come then, let us speak without wasting time. So again, oh, how should we do this? You know, we need to say all the necessary things, but we don't want to overload our students. So he cares about the students. He wants them to retain this information as much as possible. And then, oh, I found an easy way to treat this, which is also a good quality to have, to be able to say, oh, this difficult topic explained in an easy way. Then specifically states what he will and will not discuss. So omit the simple constructions, but explain the double ones, so the compound ones. And then this narratological thing that I mentioned of, oh, let us speak without wasting time, let's get on with it, which also creates this feeling as if you are not reading a poem, but you are in the classroom having this said to you, and you are, you know, in this poetic simultaneity, this situation yourself. And then, as I mentioned, there's the whole first half of the poem where he explains different verbs with their cases. And then we have the middle part. Here the understanding is sometimes a bit more shaky, but the gist is clear. So he starts with saying, we have already run one course intensely, and diaulon here, course, is meant to be, well, yeah, a running course, a horse racing course, but it can also be interpreted here, of course, as a lesson, an actual course, in the way that we also use it in English. So the most beautiful foal has worked hard for me, but he must run. He should not step out of the theater because he is surrounded by whistlers, because there is only one course left. The foal, of course, is the student. So he's talking about his student being, oh, so lovely, and already having worked hard in the first half of the poem, but still some more to do. The whistlers is most likely a reference to either other teachers that are rivals and jealous, or other students. I prefer to believe other teachers, but it is of course open to some interpretation. And there's only one course left, so the second half of the poem. Then he continues, by running it, he shall flee the hooting or the whistling of the whistlers, who say it is a horse of lead, but one that is costly. These amazed Homerids would definitely say, now, first we see the most beautiful horse before our eyes, but we have not yet seen one like this, and the rest of the verse. So again, with the fleeing the whistlers, and then the quote, well, I think it is a quote. I have not found the meaning of it yet, or whether it's a saying or an idiom. So the horse of lead, but one that is costly. I'm still looking for this. But in any case, the use of Homerids, the line further, so these amazed Homerids, is, in my opinion, ironically used. And then the quote, it's not really a quote, but is a reference to the first book of the Iliad, when he says those next two lines. So we see the most beautiful horse before our eyes. We have not seen one like this. This is a reference to Iliad, book 1, line 262. And so here in this middle part, it continues further, but already he uses extensively this metaphor to create this vision of his interaction with the student and what they still have to cover. And it's very lively and really, I feel, sucks you into this situation. And he continues further. So therefore, after the, well, double compound syntax has been organized again, he must run around as fast as possible until he sees the end nearby. Let there now be some horse-loving man who teaches, who plates the praises of horses, who flees the chastisers, who says, oh, how much I too will marvel at my horse, because as many virtues as there are amongst horses, he has collected them all. So again, he focuses on what he's going to do in the second half of the poem, and until the end. And then he refers to himself as the horse-loving man who teaches, who praises him, who flees the chastisers again. So that's why I'm inclined to believe that the chastisers, the whistlers, are fellow teachers. And then he marvels at his horse, and he proclaims that a student has collected all the virtues possible. So a very nice situation. And then there's the second half of the poem. Like I said, he does the second half more in a sort of narrative structure. And he does continue to keep in line with the horse metaphor for a while. And then the interesting bit is that he sort of creates a dialogue in the poem. So not a dialogue literally like, oh, I said this, he said that, but he says at some point, well, some people came to the student and tried to convince him to stop studying with me by saying these things. And then he continues to explain grammar, the syntax, while creating this little story of what these rivals are saying to his student. And then after that, he says, well, but I had a reply to this, or the student had a reply to this. It's not very clear. And then again, he continues to explain words while the student or he are replying to these awful people. And then we come to the end, which is the epilogue. So right before this, he takes off his mask after he has done this little intertextual play almost. And he says, all that I said was the truth. You should believe me. And then the epilogue of the poem. Here he stops explaining words. And he says, if I myself accomplished useful work, it would be well, and I would clap my hands loudly. If I should fail my purpose, these things must be made fun of by me. In games, this is sufficient for allowance. The works of those who play on one hand, and those of serious men on the other, as they say somewhere, the borders of the Mysians and the Phrygians. So he kind of humbly, maybe fake humbly, tries to say, well, I hope I did something useful. If you don't think it was, well, I should make light of it, and you should too, because it was only a bit of play. It was a little bit of a game. Don't judge me too harshly. That is the gist of what he is trying to say. And then he refers to this dichotomy again explicitly of play and seriousness. So paisonton, you see in the second to last line in the Greek, there's also a chiasm, so alla paisonton, and then spudazonton alla at the end. That's the combination I mentioned that they also link to political verse in which this poem is written. So he says, yeah, on the one hand, it's a bit of play, but it's also a serious matter. And then a typical saying, the borders of the Mysians and the Phrygians, the full saying is actually, they are separate. This became an idiom through use of Gregorius of Nazianze, if I got this correctly. And it basically enforces this separation, like this dichotomy of the two, like play and seriousness are two opposite things, but are still combined in this poem and in other didactic poems. And that is how he ends his poem and how I will end my presentation. I thank you for your attention. I hope you found it interesting, and I welcome any questions or suggestions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting material you showed us, and a very good presentation of it. And we are now opening the floor to questions. Feel free to jump in. Either it's a small group, so you can probably wave at us, or you can raise the electronic little hand. Until then, oh, Andy jumped in. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nina. It's a fascinating text, a fascinating material. So many questions. Just maybe in terms of the basics, if this is a poem that's used for teaching, how do you imagine it being used? Is he delivering this in front of a class? Is this being written down and copied by students? Do they have to read it and then just speak it again? How does that work exactly? Do we know?
So, well, we don't know for sure. Of course, it is hard to know for sure due to, well, limited evidence. It is believed, however, that these were performed. So we are quite sure of this. They were used in the classroom, and there are some, I can't think of a specific example right now from one of the poems, but there are some things even in these poems that do convince me that they must have been spoken as well. I do think that does not exclude that they were read by some other people. So I think for students, they were spoken by the teacher in class, by Niketas, but then some of his poems he addresses to a highborn child or a Mikael who may have been a part of the imperial family. So it could also have been that he let his contemporaries or the imperial family read these poems. So I think it could have been a duality, but in any case, I do think they were performed in a sense, at least.
Okay, thank you.
You said you have more. If
well,
anybody else, please jump in.
Maybe in relation to this, would be the question maybe of the manuscript transmission. How does that work? Are these transmitted in collections of didactical texts, or is it just a corpus of his own writings? And also in relation to this, maybe a third question that I had, just to continue, in terms of his own corpus, it's divided into Christian and the secular works, and the Christian material are catena and commentaries. But how do you think that works? Is that a different type of text, or does that get involved in the didactic system as well, or is it something completely different? Sorry, there's two very different
that's
questions,
fine. Okay,
yeah.
I'll do the second question first, because I think I have a slightly less complicated answer for that one. So I have to admit, I haven't really been able to look at his Christian works in detail. So yes, commentaries and catenas are part of it. There's more than just that. But how was I going to say this? Yeah, so I don't think they're completely separate. Of course, we cannot fully separate the two because the person himself lived in an age where the two were overlapping in many ways. So as I mentioned, most of his didactic poems are actually written in church meter, hymnographical meter. So that in and of itself is already, something that links it to his more Christian works. He also references, well, when he uses quotations to explain certain grammatical things, he will often go to the Psalms or other Bible quotes to do so. So like I said, it's not fully separable. It is believed that he became Bishop of Herakleia after running through the 3 steps or promotions as a teacher, and that he wrote his didactic poems during his teaching years. I'm not sure if there's a lot of work done on when he wrote which of his Christian works, but I must believe that there has been some overlap, that he wrote some of his Christian works also during his teaching days, I think. So I hope that answered that question. And then the manuscript situation, well, I do have 2 more slides in case anyone is going to ask that, if you want me to share them. Let me see.
Please do.
Yes, so the manuscript situation is a little complex. You asked mainly about what type of manuscripts they were transmitted in. So for now, I see 2 types. So one is more of a miscellaneous type, where there's a mix of all kinds of texts, both liturgical and letters, and these poems or some of these poems, so a big combination. But mostly, I don't think it's 50-50. I think there's more manuscripts that have a didactic purpose, so that contain other treatises or other didactic texts that can be linked to the same purpose. However, not all poems are transmitted in all of the manuscripts. So there's 25 manuscripts that I'm working with. If you look at I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you look at these columns, so the poem that's most transmitted is in 15 manuscripts, the least one in 3 or 5. So they're not always together. There's only actually 4 manuscripts that contain 6 of the 7 poems, and P4, the longest one, is always on its own, in different manuscripts even. So kind of a separate tradition. So that kind of complicates matters, but all of them are found mainly in manuscripts that contain other didactic texts. Yeah. I hope that was a sufficient answer.
We'll take it as that. Georgia, I saw your hand raised. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation. I would actually like to continue on what Andy asked first and on what you just showed, and that is P4, in the sense that you said that these poems were performed, were read during classes, and all of them, as you showed us, are more or less equivalent in size, except P4. So considering that it also has a different tradition, what are you imagining? Some sort of different occasion on which it was written for which was written, or in which was performed, or it's just something different from the rest? How do you see that? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So P4 is the longest. It deals with a lot more content because of it, obviously. It deals with 4 out of the 8 parts of speech. So the Greeks often divided their grammar or language into 8 parts, so like nouns, verbs, prepositions, etc. This deals with 4 of them. As such, it actually has an overlap with the poem I presented today. So the parts where he discusses verbs contains a lot of, it's not direct quotes maybe, but there's the same things in there, some same quotes that he uses to explain the material. I haven't done an extensive comparison yet, but I know there's a big chunk in there that's basically P3. So that already is interesting. It's not sure which one was written first, which kind of complicates matters. I do believe P4 also starts with addressing this highborn child for which Niketas is writing, which leads me to believe that this may have been one for reading, not for writing, more of a piece of showing this to the imperial family, saying like, I wrote this to, explain grammar to your child, but also please give me money, I mean, that's a simplified version, but I do believe that is more of its function. I cannot imagine that he would fully perform this long poem in the classroom. I think that would be a bit much. It is still very interesting. It would be interesting to be performed, but it is insanely long compared to the others. But yes, it is hard to know for sure, but that's what I think.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll throw one in just for good measure. I imagine not, but just in case, are there ancient translations? Because I'd be very curious how they would deal with that material if they started to translate it. Would they translate it as we do today? A bit of the new language and then a bit of Greek, and then what is the situation there?
So you mean, are there translations of these poems in later years, or no, not as far as I'm aware of. Of course, there's still a lot of material, especially dealing with the Greek grammatici and didactic poems that has to be looked at. It is kind of a new field, so to say, but I don't think there is. I do know, if this could be interesting to you, one manuscript that contains the long poem, P4, is from the 17th century. It's one of the latest manuscripts that I have, and it does contain notes in Latin and little hands, and the person writing it wrote the names of the quotes that Niketas uses in the margins as well, and like, here he talks about this verb, so that if that's interesting to you, it does show that it was used. Yes. It is sadly the only manuscripts, that I had that shows this. Also, it is a Salamanca manuscript, so it's not, it's from a Greek region or anything. So.
And in terms of the whole corpus, because I had to have an image about it, are we talking the whole poem, all poems put together, your edition, the one that you're working on and will be preparing? Are we talking about 40 pages of Greek text or 300? I try to.
That's a good question. I haven't put it all together yet, so I would have to make an estimate. The shorter poems, as far as I know, the shortest one is 40 verses. My collation for this one is, I think, 4 pages. Of course, just in the word layout that it is now. I think the longest one will be closer to like a 30 maybe. So all put together with, of course, translation as well. Translation is always a bit longer. And I would like to add a commentary as well. So it is going to be quite a hefty book in the end.
Gonna be a big one. Still nice, manageable corpus. Very good. Yeah. And to get at the first question of Andy and then Georgia, on the use of this material, because it struck me, you said that they deal with 4 of the 8 morphological things in Greek. Was this meant to, just to speak about Greek grammatical stuff every now and again, or was it meant to proceed systematically? Had he had enough time and enough students? Had he gone through all grammar? Can you use these poems to learn systematically about a couple of things, or it's just bits and pieces about grammar that are used, I don't know, as a mnemotechnic tool in the class, along with a proper grammar?
As far as I can tell, it is more of the latter. So the 7 poems that I'm working with already have a large variety of what they talk about and very specific things. So 2 of them are about orthography, for example, so spelling, which is interesting, is to see, well, I haven't really looked at those yet. I saved those for last, but I can imagine it was interesting to have those performed when he talks about the pronunciation confusion between certain vowels. But then, yeah, so also things to do with morphology, but always very specific things. Just like in this poem, he says, oh, I'm going to talk about compound syntax, but then he really specifically talks about, you know, a few types of verbs with a few types of cases. So I also would have to see how it overlaps with some of the hymnographical poems. I know some of them are more about things like epitheta, so common adjectives combined with certain important names, things like, I don't know, we all know the swift-footed Achilles, I think, things like that. But also he has some poems that I know about names of rivers or stuff like that. So it's not always, well, if you were to look at all of his poems and that's your only introduction to the Greek language, I don't think you'd get very far. So as far as I can tell, I do think it was more meant as like an additional thing to add on to grammatical treatises. Also because he does take from some important previous authors like Dionysius Strax or Herodianus to explain his things and to get a source material, which, well, makes me believe and is commonly believed that they still use those sources in their classrooms.
Do you think the way he chooses topics to discuss in this, if they are used in class, if they are meant to complement anything else, do you think they are chosen by, he goes by the problems he knows there are in class? Students have problems with punctuation and something like that, like we do today. We insist on things that know are problems. Is it the way you feel it happening here?
I think so. I mean, again, hard to know for sure, but at least in case of the orthography, I think we must see that in the context of, you know, the period, this pronunciation change must have been difficult for students as well. So I think in this case particularly, yes. The others, I can imagine so, because some of the things he puts in his poems when he talks to his students refer to, well, this being difficult or it being hard work or, you know, pay attention to this, don't forget this. Of course, this is all a bit of rhetoric and genre related as well, but at the same time, I mean, it would make sense if he didn't write poems about things, yeah, that the students had no problems with. So I think so, yeah.
Very interesting. Valentina has a question, and then Julian.
Yes, thanks a lot for this. My question is about intertextuality, to be understood in a wide sense, because it looks from your quotations that there are many references to Greek, like the Homerids or other like Greek sources, not Christian or the Bible. Can you expand a bit of this and the role they play in the corpus?
Yeah, so okay, maybe the parts I chose gave a bit of a, I don't know, misguided impression or something. He does quote the Bible more than he quotes things like Homer or things related to the Bible. So also there's a quote even in this poem from Joseph and Balaam, I think. So he does quote the Psalms and such more. There's just different layers in which he uses intertextuality. I kind of see it as 3 layers. So the base layer is the content that he uses for his poems. As mentioned, he uses, well, prose treatises that deal with grammar to get the content. He doesn't reference those, but he uses them. Then there's when he explains these particular things, he uses quotes to exemplify those. He will also not give a reference for those quotes, but in these cases, it's usually a Bible-related quote. And then there's sometimes, occasionally, where he will use a literary quote. Well, I would call it a literary quote. I mean, like you say, more of an antiquity-related quote in, say, an introduction or an ending or a middle. And then he will often say, Hesiod says, Homer says, this particular person says. Not always, but often. I think for him, I mean, in this period, like I said, you can't see the two as a completely separate thing. They found ways to kind of unify these ancient texts dealing with a whole different type of religion with their Christianity, of course. And it's still, well, I think he tries to place himself in this tradition of earlier big name authors that also wrote either didactic poems or just important texts like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And also because those are texts that they still used in their education. So he got trained by reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so I think, yeah, that's, I think, an explanation for why he uses that next to the more biblical quotes.
Thank you very much. Just a small follow-up question. So do you find many allusions? So non-direct quotations, but references that you cannot immediately identify?
Yeah, I'm having some trouble with some of the allusions that he's making. So the one I mentioned with the horse that is led but also costly is one that I haven't found yet. Sometimes he will, allude to something that I am pretty sure must be from a psalm or a Bible story, but I am not super well versed in this. And if it's not a direct quote, it's sometimes hard for me to find where it came from. He'll say something like, oh, this, well, instead of saying a name, he'll say something like, the truth-speaking mortar or whatever, something like that, and then say what this person has said, but not in a direct quote. So he does often do that. Well, often, occasionally. And then it is harder for me to find where the quote is from. It's easier when it comes from, say, the Suda, which he does on occasion. The interesting thing, though, is when he gets his quotes from somewhere that he did not directly read himself. So if he does a Bible quote, it's correct, so to say, but he quotes the Suda for a particular example in this poem, and he says, like the thing that Demosthenes said, no. And then you go to the Suda and it says the same. And then you go to the commentary on the Suda and they say, well, it's not actually Demosthenes who said this, it's Libanius. And so when it's not something that Niketas read himself or knew himself, he just takes over these quotes, even if they may be wrong. So I think that's an interesting extra layer as well. But the Bible references and allusions are usually correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Julian had a raised hand at some point, please, and then Ugo.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nina. I really enjoyed it, the presentation. I would like to come back to one of the verses you showed of this poem. Namely, this one, he says, the author says he's ill. How do you interpret this? Is this a topos? Because it rings like, to me, it sounds like this topos of being poor or for begging poets or being old. I can think of judges saying that he's old. Is this a rhetorical thing? Is this a biographical sort of reference? Is he mentioned this again somewhere? Is it maybe both rhetorical and biographical?
Yeah, so I have been wondering about this myself, because he does refer to illness, I'll say it in general, a couple times in his poems, in his introduction. So here he specifically says, because of the illness, I cannot breathe much, which lead us to believe that he is ill. But in some of his other poems, in the introductory scenes, he'll say things like, didactic poems, well, not didactic poems, but intellectual conversations are a remedy for the sorrows in life, or, you know, stuff like that. So things that refer to all the hardships and the illnesses and the bad things in life. This is good for this, or sort of remedy. I believe, I'm trying to think if there's anywhere else where he says something about him being ill. I think there is, but I cannot think of the specific thing right now. But yes, I have been thinking about this because it happens a bit too much to just be coincidental in any case. So I do think it could be a topos. I don't know if it's biographical, but because we don't know that much about his life other than, you know, him going through the stages of being a teacher, then becoming Bishop of Herakleia. We don't even know when he died. So I don't know if it's biographical. It could be. It could also be, like you say, more of the topos of like, oh, the beggar poet, for example, like, oh, I'm ill, please help me, you know, give me money for this poem. So I don't know. But it's interesting to think about.
Mara has a comment with regard to the previous question. A similar treatment of quotations can be found in the 9th century in the Handbook of Rhetoric written in Syriac by Anthony of Tagrid, especially with maxims. Is not uncommon that they are misattributed, of course, as is at least her experience. So that's parallel. Ugo, please.
Well, thank you very much, Nina, for this very interesting presentation. And if I can follow up on your last points, it's very important to see how these authors within these poems about grammar and stuff are speaking also about themselves, also out of topic, maybe also speaking about their performance and how they feel their performance, because every one of us, when speaking, knows about how we speak. And well, I have a lot of questions, as you can imagine. One of the things I want to point out, if you go back to your presentation, please.
Yes. Well, let me share my screen. Which slide?
The one about Hesiod.
There's a bit of a lag. Hold on.
No problem. Yes, this one. This one. Well, here we find a wonderful example of how he treats sources, because he paraphrases the verse from Hesiod in the first line, and then he adds something different from Hesiod in the second column of the verse, and then he reports what Hesiod said in the second verse, and it's very important in the second column of the verse in the same part. And I will suggest to change your or in rather than in this e, because it's a way in which he performs and also interacts with his sources. And so from this, I would like to ask, when he uses these sources, can you imagine intermediate source or not? So is reading Hesiod or not? Because this is one of the questions that we have about Niketas. If he reads ancient literature is an intermediate literature within a school class or so on and so on. And the second question I have: do you have any idea of how he organizes the material about grammar within the poems? So if we can point out sections in which he speaks about specific parts, and they can be performed separately in different occasions. These are my two main questions. Then maybe I can add another one, but still, thanks.
Yes. Well, if it's okay, I'll stop sharing, just because there's an incredible lag on the video otherwise. Okay, so for the first question, for the intermediary, as I mentioned to Valentina as well, so in some cases I can attribute the quotes that he uses to the Suda instead of the direct reading of a source, because he does not say, well, the Suda says that Demosthenes says na na na. He just says, oh, in Demosthenes it says na na na. And then, you know, in the Suda they say the same, and then you look at the commentary and it's not correct. In one case, this even comes to a funny thing where he quotes the Suda again, I think it's again Demosthenes. He does it twice, I think, to explain a kind of genitive criminis. But the quote that is used in the Suda and by Niketas is actually not a genitive criminis, it's actually a partitive genitive. So the example was actually not explaining what he wanted to explain to begin with, and he did not even notice this, he just used it anyways. So I think in those cases it's clear. In other cases, I think Hesiod and Homer are a bit more difficult to be certain if he read them like directly or not. Like you say, I mean, we do believe that these texts were used in the school system directly. So I think in the case of Homer, it may have been directly. But yeah, it's not always easy to ascertain whether he read them directly or from a different source. And then the second question, help me out again. I'm sorry. What was the second question?
If you can speak about, or if you have noted some strategies in creating the poem, in speaking about the various parts of grammar he wants to speak about. So how the poem is structured, and if there are some evidence about possible section that can be performed in different moments and not one of the other, because we have these long poems, and having a long poem means also think about a performance with all this long poem in a row, and this could be a problem if we can think this way.
So I briefly mentioned already that the first half is more of a, I explain this verb combined with this, then give an example, then it's combined with this. So those sections could be taken separately, because they're usually between either, well, the shortest I've seen is one verse, but that's, I mean, usually it's between 2 to 4 verses. He tries to challenge himself though. Sometimes he'll try to explain it in a half verse, but it doesn't always work very well. The second half is more of a narrative thing. It's, like I said, more of the story, like the kind of the play that he does within the text. So I think that half would be harder to take separately. I think for the first half, you could say like, oh, I just want to explain the verb anechomai, whatever, or dialato, and just use this. Another thing that I did not mention yet is that in the first part, it starts off alphabetical. I say starts off because he doesn't, well, he doesn't go through the whole alphabet in the first half of the poem. He doesn't have the room. And then I feel like at the end it also becomes a bit less, well, it becomes a bit more murky. In the beginning it's very much, okay, a few verbs with A and then B and then, you know, but then it becomes a little murky. Then you have the intermediary and then it's fully not alphabetical anymore. As I recall correctly, he does the same in the long poem. So I still have to do more research on the long one. I do think you could be right that maybe some of the sections, because he talks about the 4 parts of speech, that maybe the separate parts could be, well, yeah, they could be separated and used independently. I would have to do more research to know for sure, or to know in any case. But it's an interesting thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Angelos?
Yes, good morning, and congratulations for your great presentation. I just have a question about the horse, which is made of lead, but it's a lot, like costs a lot. It may be that there's I found just an expert in Themus Ravinos, which I'll send you later, that compares people like golden, silver, and made of lead, which is a bit not so great a person in terms of the qualities of the
Oh.
that started well.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we've lost.
I know him,
Angelos.
so I can message him
You lost me a lot.
afterwards.
We
Yeah,
have lost you. Yes. Maybe you try
You
without
lost me
camera.
completely. You've
Yes.
lost me
It's fine.
completely. Yeah, I'm deeply sorry, but the signal in the Vatican is really bad. I was saying that I found an expert just when I was listening to Nina's presentation about gold and silver and lead people, or sometimes iron, made of iron. So could be that it's not the best breed horse, but still works on an antithesis that it costs a lot to keep it, but it's not the best quality horse. I don't know. You could.
Yeah, if you
Let's
could
see
send me
that.
that reference, that would
Yeah,
be
I
that
will.
would be great.
I will. I
Thank
will.
you.
Thank you and congratulations once more.
And if there are no other questions, well, I'd be very happy. Andy's throwing one in before we close. Please.
Maybe a more lighthearted question to finish. Would you how difficult is it to write such a poem? Do you think you would be capable? Let's imagine you finished a PhD and you're applying for jobs in academia. Do you consider you could write a poem like that in lieu of a CV? Maybe not one of several thousand lines like P4, but maybe a short one just to put in there. What do you think?
It depends on what language you want me to write it in and about, because Greek, absolutely
Greek.
not. I'll be honest, I'm having a hard time understanding some of these poems because the way they deal with the topics is very different than we learn and teach about some of these topics or even conceive them. So sometimes it's even hard for me to understand what he's talking about, let alone me being able to replicate something like this. If we're talking English or Dutch, I could give a go at it, but I think I would need many years of practice.
Can I maybe small follow-up to this, because you just mentioned, and this was another thing I was wanting to ask, would you recommend someone now using these types of text actually teach Greek? Because you mentioned it's a very different approach. Is there something you found in there? Do you think actually this is a really great way to teach Greek and we should really take that up again? Or is it used somewhere still? I don't know.
I have this dream that I would want to make my translations and my editions as accessible as possible, let me say this. So I'm hoping to include a lot of things in the commentary and make the translation maybe not as literal, but as accessible as possible, because I would like it to be used in the classroom again. Maybe not to use, first year students, the basics of Greek, but just to see this perspective of how they did it. And I mean, I am learning things because of these poems. It's not like it doesn't work. Of course, if you spend a lot of time with them, I now know which of these verbs need to be combined with what grammatical case. So I do think it would be nice to bring them back into the classroom. I don't know how enthusiastic teachers would be about this, but a girl can dream. Or students, but a girl can dream. So
well, thank you.
Well, I can say that for skedography, there is a scholar in Greece, Herit Sanchez, who is published as Skezos, so this kind of grammatical text from Middle Ages, with all the exercises to use it in classrooms. So it's
amazing.
Yeah.
So it can be
I
done.
don't know if it is effective in our perspective, but still, it is done.
That gives me hope.
That should give us all hope one day. On this note, I'd like very much to thank Nina for her excellent paper, great material, and wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for attending and for the interesting questions.
Thanks everyone for joining in.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Have a good day, everyone.
Very good seeing everyone.
Bye-bye.